Welcome back. You may notice I'm not recording in my same bland, washed out space. I think I may have finally figured out the lighting issue. It's funny recording on these things. It looks fine lighting-wise when you're looking at the screen, and then you look at it later and go, yikes, that just looks like I'm recording in a bomb shelter. So I think I've got the lighting figured out. There's a little more color. A lot of you are going to spend most of the time I'm talking trying to figure out what's on the shelves behind me. I'm recording in my church here. Shout out to Emmaus Lutheran Church for letting me use this space. I have to say, though, it's a little weird recording and doing things in an empty building, an empty church building especially. Some buildings are different, but empty social places like an empty school, an empty church. There's a reason George A. Romero used an empty mall in one of his zombie movies. It's just creepy, right? But like many of you, I am sort of reaching peak tolerance on the self-isolation thing. The beginning of this, it seemed kind of a minor annoyance. My kids, who are 3.5 and 1.5, could still actually go outside and play a little bit. It's starting to wear a little thin. You can only play so long in the apartment complex and in the one or two other places we have available. But hopefully the end of the quarantine, the self-isolation thing is almost in sight. I don't know if I've mentioned the statistic before, but since January, my family and I have been not in self-isolation or quarantine for about 10 days. So it's getting a little old. But cheers. We're almost through it, I think. We're on the last week of Mouse. I hope you have enjoyed the story. I know it sounds a little strange, like I said before, enjoying a Holocaust story, but it's really a pretty incredible story. Spiegelman is a master of the comics field, the comics art form, and has done a lot of fascinating things to make the book work. We will be moving on from graphic novels to other things that involve narrative, so I hope the shift isn't too great. My hope in all of this is simply that A, you appreciate it, and B, you get something out of it. The whole reason I am talking a little more in depth right now about textual analysis, close reading, is so that you can have a different level of engagement with the text. I teach it because I enjoy it. I like being able to read that way, being able to just read it sort of broadly, but also take a step in and really think about what's going on. So today we're going to talk about specifically the question of photographs. And I say question of photographs because some of you have mentioned in your individual responses, and I've heard it from others as well outside of this course, that photographs seem more capable of connecting with people. Like you see a photograph of a real thing and you go, wow, that's what it was like. And so there's an element of access to reality that photographs seem to give. But what else is going on there? There are lots of scholars who've problematized that idea that you have some kind of access to reality. And as we'll see, Spiegelman definitely takes advantage of that in Mouse. So let's dive in. Morning and post-memory, I'm calling this. We'll get into why the term post-memory in just a second. But 2 weeks ago, we looked at the idea of the icon in comics. An icon is just something that represents something else, but isn't actually that thing. And so Scott McCloud, in his Understanding Comics, has a whole range of how iconographic things are. So basically, the less like something an image is, the more iconographic it is. So if you have an image of a person, it's a cartoon, but there's just a giant circle for a nose and then an eye, very iconographic because your mind has to do a lot of work to make that into a person. Now, photographs occupy a place that's nearly opposite that. They don't seem to represent the thing at all because you're looking at the thing exactly as it is, or that it appears to be what we do. They appear to lack any iconographic content. Now, this is tricky because the great French scholar Roland Barthes points out that a lot of times the most memorable aspects of someone or something are not present in a photograph. And he came at this trying to really connect with his mother, who was dead at that point, through old photographs. He was just sort of trying to find the real person, the person he remembers. And she just never surfaced, no matter how wonderful the photograph. And as he puts it, not only is photography never, in essence, a memory, but it actually blocks memory, quickly becomes a counter memory. Now, what he means by this is that you can have a picture of a real person in a place that they were. You can actually remember it, but the photograph is not actually what you remember. It may be part of it, but it can also become problematic, something that blocks your memory because it's insisting this is the real person in the real place. What you remember is not as real because you can't put it in front of somebody and show them. This is the material record of that person in that place. So your memories are perhaps your own subjective impressions, but not the real thing, right? It's the real thing. That's what the photograph is. Photographs for Barthes are peculiar because they're so precise. They demand that we take them seriously as precise representations. Not even just representations, precise windows onto a moment or a place. But oftentimes, and this is just common sense, right? Sometimes photographs are meaningful because of what they're not showing us. Everyone's had this experience. You're looking at a photograph of you or someone in your family, maybe all of you together in a place on vacation maybe. Now, the photograph itself is interesting, but really what it does is it jogs all your other memories about that place. If there's a photograph of you and your friends at the beach, after looking at that photograph, you are likely also then thinking about the way the sun felt, the way the sand felt on your feet, maybe a dumb story your friend told you shortly after that photo. So the photo itself is a starting point, but it's not the whole thing that you remember. So in that sense, it's still an icon because the whole experience is not in the photograph. You are still in possession of the whole experience, and the photograph is just sort of leading you to that. Now, this is huge when we start talking about images of historical tragedies, historical trauma, like the Holocaust. Because what exactly are we looking at? There is a danger in photography like this sometimes because we appear to have access to the real thing. But of course, what we're actually accessing is a tiny fraction of that thing. And so basing our understanding of that event on the photograph can be troubling. You may have run into somebody sometime, for example, if you've been on a trip somewhere, I don't know where, pick a country, Russia. You may have run into someone later saying, oh yeah, I've seen lots of pictures of Russia, and you could think to yourself, yeah, but it's nothing like that, because you have to actually go there, have impressions that are not in the photograph. Now, when I've taught this class before in an actual classroom, one of the exercises we do is I don't preview them ahead of time. I just say, take out your phones or your tablets, computers, whatever. And I want you to go on Google and just type in the word Holocaust. And everyone does it. I say, now click on images, and I want you to count the number of photographs you see. Now, there's always a pause at that point, and people go, what do you mean count the photographs? There's like, it's uncountable. And that's the point, right? You are so bombarded with these images that it effectively kind of outsources or exteriorizes your experience of this event, because instead of having to engage in narrative, instead of having to sort of construct in your own mind what has happened, you sort of just put the reality somewhere else. And this can also be problematic because we always have a heightened emotional response to things like photographs because it seems so real. And sometimes that serves to sort of make people not do anything about what they're seeing. Because if I feel terrible about this event, clearly that means I'm not complicit. Clearly that means I'm different than the people perpetrating it because of my emotional response to this thing. Right? But it's an icon. It's representative of a moment, but it's not the entire moment in itself. Now, in a very real way, this is the core struggle of Mauss. Art Spiegelman, the real Art Spiegelman, and of course the subject, one of the subjects of the narrative, is dealing with something that Marianne Hirsch calls post-memory. It's a long quote, but the gist of it is that these are people who are born after a traumatic event has taken place, and their entire lives are determined by a narrative they did not live through. They are haunted by people they'll never meet. but who are so real in the lives of those around them that they have to grapple with them all the same. But how do you do that? How do you grapple with a ghost? How do you position your own narrative to be something different than what came before you, especially when you have absolutely no idea really what that narrative was like? And it's important that Art Spiegelman puts photographs into the text of Maus, right? Because a lot of Holocaust survivors' kids looked at these photographs and, like us, just felt deeply moved or horrified. But there's a limit to how horrified you can be by a photograph because you didn't live through it, so you sort of have to move on. But the people who live through it, who take up the photograph as an icon and are instantly transported back to that moment, can't move on. There's some events you, as an old pastor of mine put it, that you get through but not over. Now, why use photographs? I mentioned the connection to post-memory is an important one, but why use them in a comic? Everything is drawn. There's no real need to put in a photograph, but he includes a few. So why use them in the text? Now, we're going to use some of our textual analysis skills here to sort of analyze not just why, but what is happening with these photographs in our text. So we start with observations as always. Here's just what I'm going to start with. I sort of just picked it at random. In the narrative itself, this occurs at a point really towards almost the end of the book when Vladek is telling Art about having escaped from this experience and going in search of Anya. That may be a bit of a spoiler alert, but anyway. So first, the thing I noticed is the photograph is set at an angle. So the panels are all nice and square, but this is not. Okay, the photograph does occupy a panel just like a regular comic. There's actually a panel frame drawn around it. The panels directly to the right of it feature Vladek in bed. Vladek does not show Art the photo. He only mentions it to him. It is in his desk, but nobody in the comic actually takes it out. The cap in the photo is set at a jaunty angle, and the uniform is perfectly clean and pressed. This does not really look like a concentration camp survivor, right? Vladek looks nice and healthy. The uniform definitely does not look like something someone wore in a concentration camp. So it's a very peculiar thing, very peculiar image. Now, we can make a lot more observations. As I've mentioned before, there's no dumb observations. We could note, oh, there's a curtain behind Vladek, or there's a photograph in the frame there where Vladek is talking to Art. I passed once a photo place. There's an actual photograph on the wall there, a picture. Lots of stuff you could mention. These are just 5 that I'm noting for space's sake. One of the things that I mentioned in terms of interpretation and observation is to compare what you're looking at to other similar moments in the text to see if it's done in the same way. So here's another, and this is one of the most famous sequences in the book, Prisoner on the Hell Planet. You should know also that Prisoner on the Hell Planet is actually a comic that Art Spiegelman drew up. This is the actual comic, right? He just included it in the text. Him trying to deal with his mother's suicide. Now this photograph is also presented at an angle, right? So angle, angle. It's even the same angle. There's a hand holding it. Now there's no hand in this one, but there is here. It does not occupy its own panel. It's included in this sort of title panel here. Art and his mother are in the photograph. The other one is just Vladek. And it crosses very briefly the gutter. And if you remember the gutter, that's that space just above or around a panel that's white, usually, that separates it from other panels. And as Scott McCloud points out, is usually indicative of a passage of time or a shift in focus. So those are the things I notice about this one. Here's one more. Now this is not actually a photograph, but it's a comic rendering of a photograph. That's an interesting thing in itself because clearly McCloud has not McCloud, but Spiegelman has the ability to put an actual photograph in the text. Why draw a cartoon of one? That's a question you may decide to answer on your own time. But one of the things I notice here is, yet again, it's at an angle, right? And it also crosses the gutter. Now, when we are dealing with sequences like this that have similarities, I always key in on that. If you notice something, some detail that is repeated again and again and again, it's very important and worth thinking more about because, as I mentioned, this is a comic. Everything you're looking at is something that the comic artist made a conscious decision to put there. Right? A photograph can have some accidents. This cannot. So if these are set at an angle, Spiegelman made a conscious decision to set them at an angle. Observations of observations. I included a sort of a phantom number 2 there. This is another series of image sort of comic renderings of photographs. Whenever there's a photograph or a cartoon rendering of a photograph, it is set at an angle to the rest of the panels. This is interesting to me because it is without exception. The only really exception is, I'll shift back here so you can see it, the picture of, I assume it's pronounced Rishu. I don't speak German or Polish, so can't really say for sure. But this occurs before we get into the panels. It's on its own page. All the other comics that are actually, or all the other photographs that are actually in there are at an angle. Photographs in the text also always pass over the gutter. They appear to be sitting on top of the comic that Spiegelman is drawing. And photographs are always of people close to the main characters. You don't have a comic rendering of scenery, for example. Interpretation. A lot of stuff you can do with this. In the Prisoner on the Hell Planet sequence, there's a cartoon hand holding the photograph of Art and his mother. All the other photographs in the text are set at a similar angle, suggesting that we read each one as being in the hand of someone who is not depicted in the text. Now go back to Marianne Hirsch's idea of post-memory, that there is always a figure, or always figures, haunting the child of a survivor of a trauma like this, that person will never see, but who are deeply there nonetheless. In this particular comic, you will find out in the very, very last panel that Spiegelman draws one of the ghosts that haunts this story, because Vladek will mention him by name. It's the last thing Vladek says in the book, is he mentions his character by name without knowing he's doing it. It's a very moving section. But in this case, all the photographs in the text are at an angle, and the Prisoner on the Hell Planet sequence suggests that in all those cases, we should imagine a hand holding it that way, because the rest of the text is nice and square and set up, except for this, which is not. So Mouse, whenever it includes photographs like this, can be read as a visual representation of the presence of this ghost, this figure, this post-memory for Spiegelman. The photographs are the only records Art has of these things, and they're held at an angle to the rest of the text, giving the impression that someone's watching, someone else is involved, and it upsets the visual order of the panels. So you're reading along in a nice square fashion, then you come across this, kind of weird at an angle. So are these. You kind of have to shift your eyes around to take a look at it. It's unsettling and jarring, which is precisely the point. Whenever you have a photograph, it's a record of something that Spiegelman has never experienced, but haunts the composition of the text anyway. Now, of course, to some extent, this is true of any meaningful photograph, especially if it's painful or a record of something painful. We look at the photograph sort of hoping to have access to something we can't access anymore. One of the things that I have a hard time with personally is that I have moved a lot in my life. My father was in the military, and so I've now moved 17 or 18 times. I think I moved 13 times before I went to college. I don't regret it. There were a lot of amazing things that I got to see and do, but it gives the impression that what you're experiencing now is extremely fleeting. And it's always been weird to me to have a very powerful experience somewhere and to know that you can't ever go back to that. Recently, in fact, just before I came here to teach this class, I was in Tianjin in China, and I had spent 7 years in Tianjin before. It's probably the best time I've ever had in my life. It was fantastic. Professionally, personally, wonderful. And ever since leaving, I used to love looking at photographs and smelling certain things that reminded me of being there, like kind of green tea. I would consciously go in search of those things to bring back those memories, to seek out those icons. And it was always peculiar to me that I couldn't ever go back. You can't go back. That sounds very cliche, but it's true. And for me, being in Tianjin this last time was a way to close that door. I don't seek out those photographs as much anymore. Somehow, having been back physically and being reminded that, no, this is not the same place. That place is far away. Provided some closure. But you can understand what Spiegelman might have been going through writing this text. He has records in his father's head, in the photographs, of a time that was so painful and so powerful that an entire generation, his father's generation, was ruined by it, but Art's generation was so overshadowed by it that it was very difficult to construct their own narratives. And so when you see these photographs in the text, you are seeing that record present in front of you. Now, of course, that's just one thing to take away from it. If you want to reflect on this, particularly when we have our final project, this would be a great thing to reflect more on if you want. So this is the last week we're doing Mouse. We will be moving on shortly to the novel The Plague by Camus. We'll also take a quick detour through the short story The Mask of the Red Death by Edgar Allan Poe. We will talk more about those later. They are not true stories, but they are dealing with a thing, a disease that was true. So I hope you've enjoyed Mouse, and I look forward to reading your reflections.